just going to go for
of his Victorian premier's award-winning ghost novel, Ghost River. I would also like to note, as Chrissy did, that all these books are adorned by breathtakingly good covers designed by a superb Larrakia artist named Jenna Lee. So just how good are Tony's new books? Well, Tony has had his best reviews ever for these works so far and has somehow managed to win over some of Australia's toughest critics. For example, in The Age, critic James Lee commented that there is something of a renaissance in Indigenous writing going on in this country at present. Dark as Last Night and Whisper Songs demonstrate why Birch is considered one of this informal movement's most respected figures. These books are finely crafted, impassioned, clear-eyed, and ultimately validating works. While Geordie Williamson in the Saturday paper wrote, and I quote, "Tony writes stories as Ernest Hemingway suggested a true practitioner of the craft should, with the devotion of a priest and the guts of a burglar. But he also shares with the great modernist a determination to winnow the inessentials. His prose is beautiful in its sense of restraint." I think that's high praise indeed. What all Tony's work does is to shine a light on some of the most marginalised and disadvantaged in our communities, giving them a voice and an agency that reveals our prejudices and misplaced assumptions, and laying bare our common humanity. His work reflects on how cruel society often is to those with the fewest opportunities, or who are trapped by poverty or domestic violence, or who face discrimination. Tony's books are also paeans to family and the importance of those extended bonds. And these books showcase that possibly more than any other that he's written. His love for family rings out throughout these works. Tony is a very loyal person and has been loyal to UQP for many, many years. And I want to recognise that and say it's very, very mutual, Tony. Congratulations on your new books this year. I will do all in my, albeit limited powers, to ensure that by the next time you publish a book, we'll be able to celebrate its launch in person. Well done, Tony, and back to you, Chrissy.
Thanks so much, Aviva. I really do think that it has been so tough in the last couple of years for people launching books. I mean, Tony has such a great following and people absolutely love his work already. But with a year with 3 books in it could certainly have extended his reach astronomically. And I do feel that these kind of lockdowns and the inability to tour a book has really deprived important readers of discovering this wonderful, wonderful storytelling voice. So it's great that we can do whatever we can, just this small gesture, this Zoom event. It's up to you guys now in the audience. There's a huge audience here tonight to purchase the books, to read the books, and then to also spread the word about how great these books are in the world. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Rhianna Patrick, who is going to take over. Rhianna is a Torres Strait Islander journalist and broadcaster with more than 21 years experience. You wouldn't really believe it when you see her face on your screen because she doesn't look like she could possibly have been working for that long, but she's amazing. Everybody welcome Rhianna.
Thanks so much, Chrissy. Look, as a Torres Strait Islander, I too would like to acknowledge where I join you from virtually, and I live and do my work on the lands of the Jagera, Yuggera and Yugarapuul peoples of the Ipswich region, which is one of the regions in southeast Queensland. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and am grateful that I can do my work here on country which is not my own. Tony, I think like everyone who has read these books, it's been an absolute pleasure to read across these 3 different forms of expression that you have. And I wanted to know, if we start with Whisper Songs, it got me thinking about poetry and what poetry is for you. And I wondered, is it the start of an idea that could lead to a short story or something more? Or is it the finishing of an idea that you've explored elsewhere?
Thank you. And just before I answer the question, I do want to thank you personally, Rhianna, for agreeing to speak to me. If you've been in the business 21 years, you must have started in primary school, I think. But I also want to thank Avid. They're great supporters of my work, so it's a pity we can't be in Brisbane. And clearly, I want to thank Aviva for the incredible, generous words. And I'm on Wurundjeri country also, in downtown Fitzroy. So I'm of the Fitzroy Black Clan, we like to call ourselves. And so it's a privilege to speak on Wurundjeri land. I think that the best way to answer the question, Rhianna, would be to say that I'm sure that there would be particular poems in this collection and poems that I've published earlier and elsewhere where thematically they're very much linked to issues that I would take up in short story and in long form. And obviously in this collection, if you look at that section of water poems, the ideas that I dealt with in Ghost River in particular is a return to some of those ideas. And in fact, some of the locations that I write about water in this poetry collection are the same locations along the Birrarung, or what people know as the Yarra River, in Collingwood and Yarra Park. So it is very close to the fiction. I think that in practice, it's probably, Rhianna, some ways to explain this is to think visually. It's the difference between a photograph and moving film, and to think of moving film as the short story or the novel. Whereas I do think of a lot of my poetry as just taking a single image. This doesn't apply to the archive poems that I've been doing for many years, which interrogate colonial archives, but a lot of the other poems, so the family poems in this definitely, the water poems in this definitely, I try to imagine them as a still image and then I move on. So my way of thinking about the poem, of writing it and then delivering it and leaving it, is actually quite economical, both in the time that it takes me to write a poem and then what I think should be done with it. So I imagine that I might be opening up a book of family photographs or something like that. The exception, of course, in this collection is I have a poem in Whisper Songs called Waiting for a Train with Thelma Plum. And then I have a short story in Dark as Last Night, Catching Trains with Thelma Plum. And I do like that because the poem doesn't leave the station, but the story, my sassy young Aboriginal woman with her hoodie on and the flag gets on the train. So that was all based on one experience I had waiting for a train and being on a train. And so that it's a really good, in a way, an example of the difference, because in the poem, it's just that snapshot of seeing that really tough young woman on the station, which I did see. And then you can imagine the short story as a moving image of what happens later. So I suppose to finish that, Rhianna, it's just a way of me saying, to think about it I use terms like in a concrete form, if you're looking at it, like, or the architecture. The story is it's just a way of moving it on rather than the image, which is not surprising. I love photography, both for taking photographs and looking at photographs. And I think for me, the poem and photograph are very interconnected.
So Tony, if we're looking at those snapshots as you put them in Whisper Songs, I mean, those snapshots are divided into 3 sections. And I wonder, why you've put blood, skin and water as those sections for the collections of these poems.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, the water poems are sort of quite obviously, I think, self-contained. They relate to, I was actually commissioned to write some water poems in conjunction with Red Room Poetry in Sydney. So Annie Tapew, who edited Whisper Songs, her and Cameron Bennett approached me from Red Room Poetry to write a series of water poems, which were then connected to an exhibition at Tarawara Museum here in Victoria, or Art Gallery Museum, sorry. So that body of water poems grew out of that provocation. And I think it's really interesting. And for me, I'd written water poems, I suppose, but when Annie approached me, I just started thinking about water all the time. I was in the shower and I'd think about water. And it's wonderful when someone gives you a gentle provocation. Oh, would this interest you? And then you find yourself being consumed by the provocation. So the water poems are fairly self-contained, but they're also come out of the last 5 years, Rhianna, before I left academia last year, I was working in the Mundani Balok Aboriginal Centre at Victoria University, yeah, with really great people like Paula Bella, the artist, Kim Kruger, Gary Foley, Karen Jackson, just great, wonderful people. And my 5-year project was to work on climate justice and climate change, and a lot of stuff around water was part of that. And I'm also I've been involved heavily with SEED, the Indigenous Climate Change Group, and I'm actually just joined the board of SEED. So those poems were also, really interested in issues of protection of country for Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people. Obviously, dealing with climate change in Torres Strait is really difficult. The blood and skin poems, to be honest, some of them could have been interchangeable. So you could argue that some of the skin poems could go in the blood section and vice versa. But essentially, the first section of that book, the poems are largely about family, very personal memories of family. And people know this, several of the poems in there relate to the sudden death of my younger brother, which is now 2 years ago. So I wrote poems about my younger brother as a child more than as an adult. And those poems do link to the whole issue of blood and skin. And I think what collided for me, or what was intermeshed, is that these personal stories and personal deep grief is also interacting with community grief around issues like deaths in custody. So not as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement overseas, because we've been fighting for justice around many issues, including deaths in custody, for many, many decades, right across Australia, as you would know. But they really, to me, were co-related, so that when I thought of my younger brother's death in the months and even a year afterwards, and then when I would read about shocking deaths of young Aboriginal people and older Aboriginal people in custody, I couldn't help but relate the two, because my younger brother lived marginally for a long time. He would often be, well, to be honest, wander the streets. He had a safe home, but he had some psychiatric issues, and he would wander the street. And I was always worried about my younger brother and his relationship to police, and fortunately nothing ever came of that. So some of those issues are really intermeshed. And there's a poem about Burke and Wills, the crazy failed explorers. Imagine two white fellas in Melbourne saying, "Oh, let's go to the top of Australia and come back. Isn't that a great idea?" And there's this weird memorial to those two men in the cemetery. And my grandmother's grave is really close by. And I just think of my grandmother taking the piss out of these guys and saying, which she says in the poem, "What were you thinking?" So the family stuff does leak into that other section as well. So I think in those first two sections, now obviously when we think of blood and skin, they are of course interrelated, but that was the essence of it. Yeah.
Tony, I was particularly drawn to the 8 Truths of Khan, which is in Skin. And I wanted to know about, does this come from a true account?
Yeah, so Bhuta Khan was my great-grandfather by marriage to my great-grandmother. And my great-grandmother had originally married an Irish Catholic guy who was very violent. So there's a lot of men in my life, fortunately not in this generation and my kids' generation, have been very violent men. He was an extremely violent man who treated my great-grandmother really horrifically. And I actually recently was able to get hold of the proceedings of her divorce case, which was very difficult to get a divorce for a woman to petition for a divorce in the 1920s. And in that document, it's clear the level of violence that she'd been subject to. And then this guy, Bhuta Khan, was he sold stuff in the street. He had a trolley, and he sold fabrics and cottons and stuff. And he sold stuff to my great-grandmother, and he must have been a bit of a charmer, because they fell in love and they got married and had 5 children, my great uncles and great aunties. And Bhuta wanted to take my great-grandmother to the Punjab to meet his family. And Bhuta had come to Victoria in the 1890s, before there was Australia. And, we sometimes have to remind white Australia it's a very young country in that sense. So in the 1890s, there's no federation, there's no Australia. So he came here because Victoria was a colony of the British Empire. And by the way, in those days, men and women from those countries could travel freely to the colonies. With 1901 and the shocking Immigration Act, the colour bar restricted people coming to Australia from those countries. And you probably know this history yourself of the people who were forced to come to Australia from the Pacific and work in the agricultural industry, and then were excommunicated back to their countries in the 1890s in Queensland. So he wanted to take my great-grandmother back to the Punjab, but he had this great fear that if he left Australia, he wouldn't be able to come back, because when he wanted to come back into the country, he could actually be refused entry because being a coloured man, a man from India. So he had to request an exemption from the Immigration Act, and he had to do that every 2 years of his life if he wanted to travel back. And of course I know the story in the family, but I also went and I have his whole file from the Immigration Department. And the 8 Truths of Khan is based on using some of the original transcript and then embellishing it. And I've always done this with my archive poems. And what I'm trying to do with an archive poem, as I call them, is trying to demand that the archives speak the truth rather than hide behind bureaucratic language. And the essence of my feelings about Bhuta Khan is that it's very upsetting to think that he was revered in our family. He's a very gentle man, a very devout man. He prayed 5 times a day. He didn't drink or smoke. He had wonderful, people, a man of great character. And yet he had to humiliate himself every 2 years to get this exemption. And when you read the letters, he got employers to write letters on his behalf and clients, people he'd sold a lot of stuff to. And that's good. But they were so patronizing in the way that my ultimate feeling of reading his file is that he was treated like a child. Like he's this black man or this colored man who we'll let him stay in this country, but only because he will defer to us. And in that sense, the shocking deference that he had to perform, and you would know this, I'm sure, from your own family, is that Aboriginal people do this as well, where we've had to defer to white people in order to get around racism or to deal and be confronted by racism. And I know that there were people who he met who he had great friendships with, white people in Fitzroy, so they lived here in Fitzroy, but he was subject to racism every day of his life. Like every day of his life, he would be called, terrible names, as I used in the poem, but wouldn't use here. And I'm really proud of his dignity, because he would never, he would tell my great grandmother, once I answer back, I'll never stop. Once he answered back, he would never stop, and he could find himself deported, if he got into a fight or something. So he had to hold himself his whole life, which, again, I know Aboriginal people who have had to go through the same experience of dealing with the humiliation of not being able to speak out, because by speaking out, the cost could be the removal of your children or the loss of your house. And so it was really to pay respect for him, but to also to make a point that these documents don't tell the truth, or they don't give you the full story, and my work tries to make that story known to people.
Yeah, Tony, I really like the way that you kind of use the bureaucracy of what he's going through to explore that deeper conversation. And, I thought it was quite clever, in the way that you have that conversation around race and good character, and the conversation that you're having there. And I guess was that also a large part of it, was to show, as the poem goes on, you can see that bureaucracy aren't exactly sure what they're doing either. They just know that they don't want to give any concessions or make it look like they're giving him anything to go on.
Oh yeah, and I think the interesting thing for me is that colonial documents, and I've done a lot of stuff on the Protection Acts in Victoria and looked at them, of course, nationally when I did the novel The White Girl. What you realise is that these documents are sort of mad. there's a craziness to them which isn't self-evident. So, you know, in the protection annual reports in Victoria, where they do the inventory for places like Healesville, which is Corndurk, mission outside Healesville, they'll give an inventory and they'll talk about, yeah, how many bushels of grain, how many packets of nails, and then they'll just list, you know, Aboriginal people in that document the same way they do goods and services and stock. And then you read it, and what you're looking at is the most inhumane document, camouflaged as a ledger. And when you look at that, you think this person is counting Aboriginal people in the same column they're counting sheep and nails and fencing wire. What does that say about a society? And I don't think it's self-evident. I don't think for them writing that, I don't even think they understood how violent that was. Or they weren't able to reflect on the level of the inhumanity of that. And I think that's part of the work I do, is to expose that, but it's also to say, yeah, this is how dangerous racism is. I'm not saying people are innocent of their racism or completely ignorant. You know, racism, it's got to be proactive, but there's what's illogical about some of these racist ideologies is that people themselves don't really understand the extent to which they have no sense of the humanity of people. So they'll often, you know, adopt a very patronising tone as if that's enough, as if that says, oh, I'm showing my benevolence, when it's impossible to show benevolence when you don't regard an Aboriginal person as any more valuable than a cow, you know.
Tony, you mentioned before that in your poetry, we do see that story around Thelma Plum and that young girl in the hoodie. And I want to take that to where it appears in Dark as Last Night in your short story collection, where you've extended it there. And you mentioned that one is in the poetry, in the poem, she's on the station. And then in the short story, she's actually on the train. How did you flesh that out? And, you know, where does that story take us?
Well, it takes us ultimately to Thelma Plum loving the story and me getting an email from her manager. So, you know, I'm an old man, but I have hipster young daughters in their 20s, and they just thought that was, you know, I'd made it once that had happened. So that's where it led to ultimately. I was so happy, and I know that she's been sent both the books. What it is, I think, is that it's about, I do think that if people who make creative work, yeah, whether you're talking about writers, photographers, artists in other forms, I think what all creative people are doing is they're producing a story, a narrative, whether it be straightforward or not, through their work. And I think that, you know, I don't like to, you know, sort of think that artists are special or that writers are artists, but I would say that, yeah, I know a lot of writers and I know a few artists, and I think what I would say of value, or what I value in those people, is they have an insatiable sense of curiosity. They're always curious about the world. And then they have really great, I think, really great observational skills. And I mean, just skills based. And those two, curiosity and observation, then produce, I think, a need to express, a need to engage. And yeah, when I talked about provocation, that's a provocation. So when I was standing on the station at somewhere in Sydney, I don't, you know, way out, I didn't know Sydney went that far. It's, you know, it's so big a place. I was way out in Sydney, and I was feeling a little bit miserable, and everyone else was feeling miserable except this young woman who had her headphones on to explain the situation, and she had her hoodie with not only the Aboriginal flag, I know it had something on it, you know, some expression of, you know, of political power. And she was, yeah, when you people with headphones, they sort of start singing, they don't know the singing. So she was singing and she was dancing, and everyone was annoyed. I don't think some people were annoyed because she's a young Aboriginal woman. I think some people were annoyed, but this woman can't be happy. Yeah, we're not allowed to be happy. And so just that got me. I just thought, good, you know, that was so fantastic. And then we got on the train in the same carriage, and her headphones were ones where you could hear that that sort of sound. And that did put people off, and she got into this altercation with this guy who was a jerk. But when you're working with fiction, Rhianna, you can't be stuck with the facts, because otherwise you could do a memoir piece or a essay, as I do. So that, for instance, the couple who are the poets coming down from the Blue Mountains, there were no, well, there could have been poets, but there weren't these, and they're deliberately caricaturous. So, I'm sure if there are any poets in the audience tonight and they pick the book up, they'll just say, oh, look, he's just so, Tony just creates these terrible caricatures of poets, how mean. They are self-consciously caricatures. So it's a humorous story as well as, I think, a sassy story. So once you start thinking about fiction, you think, well, I've got this framework of this young Aboriginal woman really being proud and sort of in your face a little bit, not in any aggressive way, but being strong, and this guy being really annoyed about it. And then what you do as a fiction writer, okay, what am I going to do with that? So I don't worry about, of course, when you're writing fiction, well, how much of that is fact and how much of that is fiction? It is fiction. So then it becomes a story where someone says, well, what are you wanting to do with this little story? It's a very short story. It's under 2,000 words. I may want to do one thing. I just want to do a lovely portrait of a young Aboriginal woman who's out there and proud to be herself. And that's what the story's about. Everyone else is just baggage in the story. I just wanted to, and I think, Rhianna, it's relative to this collection that if you take that story, if you take the title story, Dark as Last Night, if you take the story Flight, certainly the story Manger, they all have teenage or young adult women in them. And all of those women, in the case of Dark as Last Night, the girl's only 10 years of age, but all of these girls or women are really tough. They're really funny. I mean, I think the girls in the Manger are really funny. The girl in Flight is really tough. And what this book reflects, it's interesting. I think it's a flow on from the White Girl, in a strange sense that the White Girl, we have, the Aboriginal matriarch, Odette Brown, and Sissy, her 13-year-old granddaughter. And I imagine subconsciously that, because Sissy in the White Girl, she's a little bit shy. She's under the protection of her grandmother. She's a little bit naive. She doesn't realise the extent of the racism that her grandmother and herself are subject to, and the danger that she's facing. I sort of imagine that these girls, they're a bit like Sissy, but a bit more street smart. So I imagine that part of her is sort of translated into these other stories and given her some growth. And I like that without really thinking if that is definitely the case. In other words, I don't plan that. But I notice my female characters, as I've written more, my female characters have become much more to the front of stage, if you can imagine it that way. If I go right back to shadowboxing, the mother in shadowboxing is not even named, and although there's a sister, she's sort of backgrounded, because that book really was dealing with male violence and aggression. I think as I've worked more and more, and particularly with, and in Common People, the other collection of stories, in The White Girl and in Dark as Last Night, you see these much stronger women, the mum in shadowboxing was strong, but I think what I'm doing now is I'm bringing these women to the front of the story, and they're taking their voice and their actions are taking over.
Yeah, Tony, and I wanted to ask about that because women, particularly across these three books, feature quite heavily. And I guess, why do you write about them the way that you do? Because I felt that particularly across Dark as Last Night, you've got there's a type of reverence that you have for the women that you're writing about, sometimes showing silent strength, but also that they seem to be the keepers of the community in this collection too, in a way.
Well, I mean, in some ways, only because that's the fact. So that I think it's reflected that I've grown up in a really, as much as my family as a child was pretty crazy and very dysfunctional in some ways. The women in my life from childhood have been invaluable to me. So, yeah, I was talking before we went on. I was at my mum's house last night, and she's in her 80s, and you're just sitting there with your mum, and she's a bit grumpy now and then, but just to be in her company. And I just always come away from a conversation with my mum thinking, I don't even know how she survived this long, but I do because she's so strong. My grandmother in particular, who I was very close to, and even I was very lucky to know two of my great grandmothers up until I was about 12, which is quite unusual. I have two sisters who could go 10 rounds with Muhammad Ali, literally. My older sister was the best fighter I knew. And by the way, in the story Flight, when Nish, the boy, his older sister, confronts the bullies, it was interesting because I had another version of the ending, but as we know, in that version of the ending of that story, she acts in a very violent way. I just thought, yeah, that's what my sister would do. She wouldn't negotiate. She just, take to these guys and give them a whipping. So both of my sisters are really strong. A lot of aunties who are really strong. I have 4 daughters, so they're some of them are strong. So that matters. And I suppose hanging over that is that what I want to say is that in regard to, say, reality, my reality, in regard to Australia, which is a country that has this cliche of the land of the fair go, blah 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 blah. We have terrible human rights abuses throughout history in this country. Clearly shocking human rights abuses against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and against really impoverished white people, treated really badly in a country that's supposed to be equitable. We've lived in recent decades the shocking incarceration and torture of refugees and asylum seekers. But what I know from personal experience and what I know as being someone who worked as a historian, the fact is that Aboriginal women have suffered the greatest human rights abuses in the history of this country, and they have been remarkably strong in confronting those abuses. So that is there in everything I write. It's always going to be there. And women generally, we're going for a period now where younger women, the generation of my younger daughters, are standing up and saying they've had enough, and whether through Black Lives Matter, and people say, oh, things are going too far. Well, of course things can't go far enough. I love to be confronted by these young people who have had enough. So that is always there in my writing. The problem with that, I don't know how I could write a bad woman. I had a so-called inverted commas bad mum in my novel Blood, but even you understood the underlying trauma she'd suffered. So when I write characters, and I'm writing women and kids, they're always characters that I do revere. And people could say that you should be braver and write I don't know, a mum who's a serial killer or something. And I just think, well, someone else can do that. It's not my job, because I think that the stories that I want to tell through fiction, what I want to do, Rhianna, through my fiction is not necessarily that the stories are related to real life, but I want to write stories that do produce an outcome where people say, these women, they're amazing. These women are amazing. So that, if you take the title story, Dark as Last Night, and while I'm on that, I do want to make a public point of this. That title story, Dark as Last Night, I was so fortunate it came from a poem called Dark as Last Night, which was written and published by Anita Few, who had done my Whisper Songs editing and then had given me permission to use that title because I'd seen something in that poem which was about the ever presence of male violence and never leaving. So in that story, what's important is that we see the mother as quite a defeated woman, and I've seen that in women who have been so downtrodden by men that, and I'm not saying this obviously as a Christian, they do give up. There's no way out. And when I was a kid, when there were no domestic violence shelters, there was nowhere for women to go. The local police would never listen to you. No one would talk about what was happening. You could see some women, it just defeated them, completely defeated them. So in that story, that is the case with the mum. But what we do is, we see the strength of the girl as a 10-year-old girl finding the strength to run off to the police station, finding the strength when her father is going to give her a whack, of her strength of, she's, and it was the last time she would take any fear from her father. And then of course the older woman next door, Little Red, that Little Red operates as a sort of a moral compass in this fable. So it is sort of a fable. One of the reviewers, and Aviva read out the review, he really loved that story, and he said, it's part of me as a writer wanting to express what he called wish fulfillment. In other words, that these men who have got away with so much violence really get it in the neck, literally. And it's like a parable. It's a parable of saying you can't do this any longer, or what you have done is unacceptable. And my grandmother, Alma, had this great way of telling me stories about violent men, and they were real life stories of violent men who had really ended up being killed or she would tell you a story about, she'd start a story and she'd talk about a woman she knew in the factory she worked at. And this is a terrible opening to the story, where when my grandmother was first assaulted by her husband and she went to work in the factory with a black eye, she asked this older woman, she said, oh, what can I do? Because she didn't realize that the man she'd married would be violent. The older woman said, oh, you just got to get used to it and hope that he drops dead. And then my grandmother told me a story that woman's husband, the next week he would come out of a pub and he got hit by a truck and killed. And my grandmother's belief to her last dying day was, once that woman had said that had put a spell on this violent husband. So she was really big on telling stories where men who behave so appallingly, they need to watch it because something can go wrong. And Darker Than Last Night is that sort of story, that this guy who acts so violently, in the end, he gets it in the neck. And it is a fairy tale, because in real life, that didn't happen in our family. It didn't happen in the families around me. The men got away with it. They got away with it. And the lives of those women didn't change until those men were dead. I've seen, shockingly, I've seen women in my family that when their violent husbands die, I've seen their face express relief for the first time in many years, because they had to put up with so much abuse in their lives. And so that story is a way of trying to give those women something to be pleased about.
Yeah, and the ending of that story, Tony, is brilliant as well, and I don't want to ruin it because I get exactly what you're saying there. I am looking at the time, and I'm aware that we still have one book to talk about, Tony, and I guess Ghost River this is a new edition that's available, but the river seems to be a common element in what you write about, across all three. And if you read all three together, there is this symmetry between all of them as well. And the river is one of those things, or at least water is one of those elements that runs throughout all three. And what is it about the river for you? Why the river?
Oh, well, I mean, I'll tell you that and then segue it into the book. I mean, the river is so important to me because, firstly, personally, my association with the Birrarung or the Yarra goes back over 50 years. So I've always lived very close to the river, and it's been so formative in my life. So as a teenager, it was more about being on the river when, the river here now, they're all like these bike paths. So during COVID lockdown, I run down the river, and it really annoys me because there are hundreds of people there at the moment going for their 1 hour daily walk in the 5K radius. And that's great. But when I was a kid, there were no bike paths. The river was a real mess, and no one was there except teenage kids, and homeless people mostly. So we had it to ourselves basically. So we would swim in the river in summer. We would just hang out there in winter. Even all the things that teenagers do that want to transgress. Go and have a smoke or a drink or whatever. So it was just a place that I frequented every day. I do long walks along the river. And what's interesting, Rhianna, is that there is a couple of really important remnant billabongs along the river, not far, like out of Kew, so about 8K from the CBD, really important Wurundjeri sites. And we used to go out there as kids and we didn't really know what they were. But even as a kid, I thought there's something really special and different about this place because it's not in the river. There were these water ponds, you know, and we still love going out there. And I didn't realize until I was in my 20s that what they were and how important that they are. So I go out there still, but they have a very different attachment for me. So by that I mean they're important to me personally, growing up in the city, and then as I, you know, educated myself and talked a lot with Wurundjeri mob. Yeah, this waterway, this thousands of year old waterway that predates European occupation, predates the Ice Age. I've written about this as a historian and a climate change activist. The river is remarkable for its capacity for strength. So that if people know Port Phillip Bay, which is a very young landmass, which was formed after the end of the last Ice Age, so not a landmass, a sea mass. When it was a landmass, that river flowed right through there across the Bassin Plains, which was we call Bass Strait, through what we call Tasmania and out to the Southern Ocean. So it was this mighty river, but its traces, its realities are still there in the ravines on the seabed outside Port Phillip Head. So for me, the Birrarung River pre-Ice Age is still there. So I'm really attached and affected by that. In the novel, though, I set the novel deliberately with these two teenage boys, Sun and Rennie, who don't know that history of the river. They're just teenage kids growing up in Collingwood, you know, they don't know anything. And they meet this group of men called the Rivermen. And I wanted to do something, and maybe if we do talk about, you know, bravery, these homeless men are both dysfunctional, incredibly wonderful. Yeah, these boys love these men. I mean, they actually love these men. And I used to meet a lot of homeless men when I was a teenage kid on the river. And yeah, we weren't scared of them. We would talk to them. I still remember a mate of mine going down the river. This might sound bizarre. And this old homeless bloke, my mate said, "What would you really want?" Yeah, because he had a little shelter there. And we thought, well, you might want a room somewhere or something. Sorry, that was my dog. He just said, "I want a beer and a shave." So my mate stole 2 cans of beer from his dad and his shaver, his razor, and gave this guy a shave. I still remember it. And I wanted to have this guy Tex as the leader of these men, and to be really honest, that he's a man who has this incredible deep understanding of the river and tells the story of the river, the deep time. So he's really revered, but he is a homeless man and he's an alcoholic. And that is dangerous territory to write about an Aboriginal man who is homeless and alcoholic, because you can understand all of the negativity that can be attached to that. I had to be brave with that because to me, for him to be homeless and a drinker was not in any way to be negative about him. It only enhanced to me his value, that even though he was suffering, even though he was living without a roof over his head, he was an incredibly important man. And I know that from my personal experience, but considering you're interviewing me, and I'm sure you know Janina Harding and Torres Strait and the mob there. Janina's mum, Auntie Eleanor Harding, who came from Darnley Island. She was a great Aboriginal matriarch for me as a young kid growing up. So Auntie Eleanor moved from Darnley Island to Fitzroy in the late 1950s. When I interviewed Auntie once, I said, what was it like going to Fitzroy for the first time from Darnley Island? She said, it was like going to the Wild West. She said it was crazy. But I remember having conversations with Auntie Eleanor and other women about homeless people and her view that, you know, someone who lived on the street and might be, you know, a drinker, and in those days, a lot of men used to drink methylated spirits. You cannot treat those people with any less value than you would treat anyone else. And her telling a little story about a guy who was an alkie asking her for a shilling, she called it, to buy a pie because she was hungry. And then she said to me, but he wasn't buying a pie, he was going to go and get a bottle of wine. And I just asked the question, why did you give it to him? She said, well, why wouldn't I give it to him? She said, I'm not going to make a judgment on him. I know what he's going to do. That's not for me to make a call on. So Tex and those men in that river novel are the last men left to protect that river when white society wants to destroy it through using it as a wasteland, through building these freeways that destroy sacred sites. Like, a lot of people don't know how much the river has been affected by the construction of freeways along there and the destruction of waterways, which I talk about, of course, in Whisper Song. So it really was a love story to the river and a love story to these men, and a story. I mean, the characters in that, Ren and Sonny, they are sort of, you know, versions of myself and my teenage friends. Sonny in particular, being something of a version of a great close friend of mine, Danny, who I've been best mates with for 50 years. And he's not, you know, he's not a university educated man. He's been a worker all his life. And I have never known anyone express love for the river greater than him. So I wanted to write it for my friends as well.
Thanks, Tony. Sorry, having a slight coughing fit
Yeah.
here at the moment. I'm so sorry. I'm in the middle of a cold at the moment and it's just caught me. What we might do is open up to questions. If you have a question, can you please put it in the box, and we might go to those.
Yeah, we've got one now, actually. So Marg has asked, Tony, you mentioned bravery a couple of times. Can you talk more about it and how you portray it, bravery, in your writing?
Well, I think there are two aspects of that. And one is that I talked about, bravery as a writer. So a writer who will deal with contentious material or maybe provoke people. I remember one of my students. I remember one of my students who was an old guy, Jahangir Bucks, and I want to say his name because unfortunately he passed away not long after I taught him. He was a man from Pakistan, actually, who came to Australia as a young man and did my writing course in his 70s. And I still remember he was introducing Christos Tsiolkos's work one day, and Christos is a great mate of mine. And Jahangir said, and I've talked to Christos about this, Jahangir said, I don't know that he's Australia's greatest writer, but he's Australia's bravest writer. And what Jahangir meant was that Christos was willing to provoke us by dealing with the really tough issues. I'm not that tough. I think that I balk at sometimes being confrontational. No, I think I definitely do. So I'm not that brave. But in my work, I suppose I try to convey bravery through how my characters react to situations around them. So just again, briefly on those men, those homeless men in Ghost River, I think they're incredibly brave. I think homeless people, and this is not romanticizing or being patronizing, homeless people are incredibly brave. They get up every morning without any knowledge of what is going to happen that day. Will they have somewhere to sleep that night? Will they have enough money to buy food? Will the police move them on? Will they go to sleep that night and someone give them a belt? To be able to survive the streets requires incredible tenacity and bravery. In regard to the women in the fiction and the girls, it's about women and girls having to live in a male-dominated world. I'm talking about the violence of men or even the menace of men. And again, I hope this doesn't sound patronizing. I have said this before. I mean, I sometimes wonder how do women survive in patriarchy? It's such a effort has to be put in, and I wonder to what extent can you not always have to be self-conscious and aware of that? Because the reason I know this is the other act of bravery is that I think for Aboriginal people, our lives are compromised every day. We have to negotiate our place in the colonial world every day. Sometimes that might be directly, it sometimes might be indirectly. So today, when I saw the Nazi rally in the city, they didn't confront me in the sense of I didn't feel any fear. I thought, how could you do this in our country? And I meant, how can you be walking on Wurundjeri country? So tonight, Aviva and myself, we've all paid respect to the country we're on. Imagine, these right-wing, racist, violent young men daring to march on our country with that in mind. That's what I thought about. So those things come up. So I think Aboriginal people are also incredibly brave. And I suppose on a quieter note, if I was to be self-reflective, the male character in Afterlife and Lemonade are both versions of me. And to be honest, after my brother's death, dealing with the grief and loss of his life, I do think I was brave. I think I did had to find some bravery, because otherwise I would have, well, I think I would have given up. It was, I mean, the only way to explain it, Chrissy, is having to deal with the aftermath of finding your brother dead. It was like I've never had, and I've talked about, coming from a really difficult family life, I've never experienced such shock and the aftershocks of that. And I think for a period I thought, I don't know how I'm going to come out of this. And I think the gentle bravery of dealing with grief is something we experience. And I have to say that I've been quite open in talking about the loss of my brother, because it's provoked really beautiful conversations with friends and writers who have gone through the same experience, and it's incredibly strengthening. And I know that me and you spoke about this in Sydney at the festival earlier in the year over those long breakfasts we were having. And I think, just to sum that up for the questioner, what I would say that, often in Anglo society, people hold in their emotion, they hold in feelings of grief or love. I would say that one of the things that I'm trying to do as a writer, and even what I do as a person, is I think these issues are best spoken of, not bottled up. And when you speak about these issues and when you write about them, you get a really generous conversation coming back, and I find it really energetic in that sense, and it gives me a lot of trust in people.
That's great, Tony. We've got another question here from Grace Lucas Pennington, who you might know.
I think so.
Grace says, love the metaphor of poem as photograph and story as film. How do you know if an image, whether seen or imagined, will be a poem or a story? Does it feel different straight away?
That's a great question, Grace. It's it's one that I often take up in workshops that I run. I think for Grace and readers and writers, what I would say is that, and I don't want to hear, the last thing I want to do is be the wise old man. I always say never listen to a baby boomer unless it's me. I think that the more you write, the longer you're practicing, and I mean practicing, and here's my latest notebook for my new novel. The more you practice, the more you start to intuit that. So Grace's question is interesting, because sometimes you do know immediately. You do know that this is just a moment. It's just that snapshot. You might think, no, it has to be something more. And I think what I would say in response to Grace's question, if it's a poem, I know straight away. If it's a short story, what I found interesting, I've published a lot of short stories, and I tend to have a process and a method that I'm very satisfied with. But I think what's interesting with Grace's question, I know it's a poem, and there might be something in there I might want to tease out. But with a short story, often I found that a short story, even though they're standalone, I do start to realize, no, there's a lot more here. So I think it might interest people to know that Blood was a long short story that I wrote for a book edited by Charlotte Wood called Brothers and Sisters. So that was a 6,000 word short story. Ghost River was a version of several short stories I'd published. And if you look at The White Girl, and I know this is unfortunately confusing for people, there are two stories in my short story collection, Common People, one called Sissy and one called The White Girl, although the white girl's not, the white girl in The White Girl is a real white girl, if I could say that. But particularly the story Sissy, even though it was set in the city, I reckon there was something in that girl that I thought I wanted to explore. So I think for everyone, the point would be to say that when I write a short story, it's often that what I find is I don't feel like the story needs to do more. I think I come to really have a real attachment to the characters, and I want them to do more. So I think in that sense, in all those novels, I've wanted to spend more time writing with those characters.
There's actually a question from our watch party, so I might actually ask the watch party to unmute so you can ask the question yourself.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the first question. Maybe somebody else in the watch party has a question. But Tony, there's always this level of humour that you have through your short stories, through your novels. How do you balance that level of humour?
I mean, people who know me, know that I'm extremely funny. I'm a very funny person.
You are.
I think what's interesting there is I certainly don't self-consciously ever consider, is this, do I need, no. So I never would think I need to inject some humor here, right? To sort of take the pressure off the story, the heaviness. Same way that I think humor for me, like all the emotions, it does naturally flow. I do think that when I'm writing, what the humorous, particularly in dialogue, the humor comes fairly spontaneously, and I'll laugh myself, like someone just told me a joke. And so I think it's natural for me to think that way. I think also, again, it's about culturally, it's about family experience, so that I can't tell them here, but it would shock people. The stories that my mum has, which are incredibly funny, are so dark and so black that if people aren't used to it, they are thinking, what the, So my mum, I'll tell the quickest one that is part of shadowboxing. My father got so drunk one night that my mother wouldn't let him in the house. So when he was trying to kick down the front door, she said to us, hide me in the wardrobe. And my mum was 8 months pregnant with my little sister. And I'll say this affectionately, and I know that I'll probably get cancelled, but my mum she had a really big bum at the time because she was pregnant. And me and my brother and sister are trying to push her into the wardrobe. And I've got one cheek of her bum and my sister's got the other, and we just couldn't get her in. And my dad is trying to kick the door in, and we're all laughing, like she's pissing herself laughing. And then when she tells that story, she'll really laugh again. And people are going, oh, hang on, this man's trying to kill you. But I think part of it is the way you survive. But part of it is that, I think that I said to Rhianna before about reading the colonial archive, some of these stories are so absurd and ludicrous that they are funny. They are funny. And, when you sit with a group of Aboriginal people talking about, whether it was people who'd lived on reserves and missions, talking about a relationship, you can't sit with a group of blackfellas and not be wetting yourself laughing. It's just not possible. And it doesn't matter what the subject matter is. And, I know that could feed into a cliche. We're all happy, giggly blackfellas. And my only response is, that's exactly right.
Hey, I know that the watch party and also people on Zoom have lots and lots of questions, but we are running out of time. I wonder whether we should just turn to the watch party for a round of applause from the group that are gathered. Is that okay, Fiona?
What a decadent looking mob.
They're great, aren't they? It's wonderful. It's wonderful to do this weird hybrid thing where we're all on Zoom, but there is a group of people actually gathering and celebrating your book in real life. I think it's an amazing thing, and maybe it's a sign of ways to get through this in the future without going completely insane, is to have groups of people meeting when they can, as soon as they can, to celebrate the writing that they love so much. So look, we don't have time for any more questions, but this has been the most amazing evening. I've really enjoyed listening to you guys chat. Rhianna, you did a fantastic job, despite the coughing fits at the end. And
Rhianna.
for doing such a wonderful, wonderful job with these books, and for UQP for getting behind them to make them such beautiful, beautiful pieces of art as well. Tony, congratulations. You are one of our greatest storytellers in Australia, if not the greatest storyteller in Australia. I really take my hat off to you. This is an amazing achievement in a year to have this much output. In the time of COVID, I think that you need to go and have a nice nap now. Being so productive.
Look, before I go, I do want to thank, I'm not going to have a nap, I'm going, I'm a Nazi hunter. We're going out to look for some more Nazis tonight. I want to thank, I do want to thank Avid Books again, and thank you, Chrissy. But just two other things I do want to say. I didn't get to thank Jenna Lee, who, I mean, I have thanked her elsewhere, but she was the designer of these 3 books. And again, I didn't know who she was. And if you said, have you heard of this woman? And I looked at the design she'd done for Drop Bear for Evelyn Araluen, which I loved. And Aviva then, I think, was able to get in touch with Jenna, and she did remarkable work on the books. I was very lucky to meet her, and to think that to work with a really important up and coming Aboriginal artist was such a privilege. So I just want to make that, and I really want to thank Rhianna again. It's wonderful to be interviewed by you, Rhianna, and even though we don't know each other personally, we do have, I think, these connections through these great Torres Strait Islander history in Melbourne of, you know, particularly through Auntie Eleanor Harding, but through Janina Harding, Destiny Deacon, very, very close friends of mine who, Kim Kruger, who comes from some family up there, is that I just wanted to say to Rhianna, it's lovely to talk to you, because the people that you would be connected to historically are very, very important Torres Strait Islander people in the history of Aboriginal Melbourne, which a lot of people don't know about. So I want to thank you too. So I really enjoyed it, and I hope everyone stays safe. And I think we've had enough earthquakes for 1 year. We've had enough. So,
thank you. Thanks so much, Tony. And thanks everyone for coming tonight. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Hi, thank you, Chrissy.